In 1989, which was the beginning of the collapse of the communist regimes in Eastern Europe, the conclusion reached in Western society, particularly in the United States, was the triumph of capitalism. That capitalism had triumphed. In fact, there was even a book and an article called The End of History, which essentially argued, and I kid you not, that we had reached perfection. That the kind of Western liberal in the economic sense, view of government and society had proven had not only proven to be the best system, but was the best system ever, and also the best system forever. In other words, this was it. We had reached perfection thanks to our greed, essentially. Was that the triumph of capitalism or the triumph of imbalance? Was that the end of history or the end of thinking? I didn't put question mark, but should have left out a question mark around imbalance too, because I think it was the triumph of imbalance, or at least the triumph of balance, in the sense that the communist countries were totally out of balance on the side of government. Government just had too much influence, too much power. The public sector was too influential in Eastern Europe and Russia, the Soviet Union, and so on. Whereas in the West, in the developed countries of the West, there was a balance at that time, roughly. We certainly had strong private sectors. We also had much stronger public sectors than we do now, but we also had a very strong plural sectors, the one in between. And I'll get to that in a few minutes as to what I mean by plural sector. So this wasn't the end of history, this was the end of thinking. Because ever since, because of that distorted conclusion about what happened, we've been going out of balance ever since on the other side. We've been going out of balance on the side of the private sector. And what's taken over most of our societies, it's most evident and most advanced in the United States, and then in other Anglo-Saxon countries, particularly England or the UK. Canada is now catching up with it, probably the most right-wing government in the developed so-called democratic world. There's an unholy alliance of economic dogma with corporate entitlement. In other words, what we're facing is a dogmatic view of human nature that has formed an alliance, in effect, with the entitlement of many international global corporations. So what's the economic dogma? Greed is good, markets are sacrosanct, property is sacred, and governments are suspect. That's essentially in a nutshell. And it's pretty clear, and you can read it anywhere over and over and over again. As one view of human nature, it makes some sense. As the view of human nature, it's utter nonsense. It's imbecilic to reduce human beings to that. To say that we all have that side of us is, of course, perfectly reasonable, but too many economists don't say that. They can't see past that. Corporate entitlement. Do we have market economies or do we have corporate societies? We have an awful lot of cartels around. In Canada, if you want to rent cell phone service, you have a choice of 2 or 3 companies whose prices are identical. That's not the only place this happens. And we have larger, much more concentration in many industries. The airline industry in the United States, for example, is reducing to very few characters. So, and if you look at the role of certain businesses or lobby groups, particularly in the United States, we're not talking about an invisible hand, but a visible law. You've all read about that in the United States. This may sound anti-business. I'll explain in a minute. This is not anti-business. This is anti a particular form of business and a particular attitude on the part of some businesses. So what you have in the U.S. government today, and it's happening more and more elsewhere, is a visible flaw rather than an invisible hand. It's involving itself in the political process. So, you know, we all know the story of the frog who, if you put a frog in hot water, it will jump out. But if you put a frog in cold water and bring up the heat, it will stay there till it boils to death. Frankly, I haven't tried it. It's a testable hypothesis, but I prefer not to, so I'll just stay with the story. We're consumed by consumption. We're consuming ourselves and our planet by consumption. The very term human resources, just think about the term human. Are you a human resource? I'm a human being. I'm not a human being. We've got this economic vocabulary. It's another example of what's going on. We've got this economic vocabulary that is just dominating us. So we have human assets and human capital and all this stuff, which reduces us basically to things. Somebody once said to be objective is to treat people like objects. So we have, and while the term human resources is so common in corporations that nobody thinks about it, sometimes people say to me, well, what else can we call it? And I say, well, we used to call it personnel, and it's okay, it's neutral. Or how about the human being department? And corporate persons, corporations are persons in America and in many countries. And what does that mean? It means actually they get certain privileges of persons. Right now, thanks to a recent ruling of the U.S. Supreme Court, the corporations now have the right, and so do wealthy individuals, to donate virtually as much money as they want to the political process. It's a complete and utter corruption of the political process. So corporations are persons. Of course, if corporations are persons, they should be allowed to vote. But the U.S. Supreme Court, for some reason, hasn't gone that far yet. But if they're persons, why can't they vote? But more importantly, if they're persons, why shouldn't they go to jail when they commit a crime? I mean, we know about lots of corporate crime. We know about major companies, big pharmaceutical companies, big oil companies, that have done dishonest things. So why doesn't the corporation go to jail? Which means, let's say, that for 6 months or a year, you're not allowed to trade. I mean, what does it mean to go to jail? It means you're not allowed to function in society. So corporations can go to jail and not function in society. So we should give corporations a choice. If you want to be persons, this comes with it. Do you still want to be persons? I think we know what the answer will be. The emasculation of government. Again, most advanced, by far, in the United States. We just had some discussions in some of the interviews now about whether the Indian government has been emasculated. I don't know. We didn't use that word, but I don't know. Probably it's certainly in a different state than it was under Nehru and so on. On the other hand, it's probably leaned too far on one side of the political spectrum. Whether it's gone the other side, I don't know. I can't answer that question. Look at the United States is the most developed country, the most advanced country. Look at the statistics on incarceration, the highest rates in the world, on obesity, shocking figures, on drug use, highest in the world, on voter turnout, extremely low in the United States. The ranking is very low on the list of countries. Income disparities, awful and getting worse. Social mobility, this is the shocker. Social mobility. The United States was famous for social mobility. Your grandfather moved there so that his son, his daughter, and their children could be mobile. Social mobility in the United States, in other words, the odds of being successful if your father was not wealthy, much lower in the United States than in several countries, including Canada, now Germany, other countries. So something is going on. And the state of the American economy. America does not have an economic crisis. The problem with the American economy is not economic, it's managerial. The problem in the American society is the state of management, called leadership, because that's superior to management. Leadership is the big stuff and management is small stuff. So leaders lead and managers manage. Very, very dangerous, dysfunctional conclusion. Managers who don't lead, who wants to be managed by somebody who doesn't lead? Or who should want to be led by somebody who doesn't manage? People who lead and don't manage don't know what's going on. So what happened with the subprime mortgages and those banks and those insurance companies? Only one of two things. Either the senior management was that cynical that they thought they could make a lot of money out of these junk mortgages and get rid of them before other people knew what was going on. Or they just didn't know what was going on in their companies. And I suspect there was a combination of both. Any chief executive who accepts to be paid several hundred times as much as the worker in the company is not a leader. Any chief executive who accepts these kind of salary scales, which you find in virtually almost all American companies today, is not a leader. There are no leaders by that definition left in corporate America, or hardly any. Handfuls of leaders left in corporate America. The first thing your salary sends out is a signal of what you feel about that company. You're sending out a signal that you're a narcissist who wants to, and you believe that your salary is the be-all and end-all of success in that company. You have no business representing. That's the problem in the American economy. I won't get into too much other management. Exploring companies and exploiting companies. The explorers are the companies that bring us innovations and new things. They're the entrepreneurial companies. They're the people with ideas. They're the people with innovations. Or they're large companies like Apple with just amazing technologies. Those are the exploring companies. The exploiting companies are the ones that are trying to establish their position based either on size, and sometimes they do good because they'll take a small technology developed by an explorer and bring it to the rest of us, or sometimes they exploit in the sense of lobbying and manipulation and doing all kinds of other things. The American economy has largely shifted from an exploring economy, of which there's still plenty of interesting, novel, wonderful companies, but it's become much more of an exploiting economy with bailouts, tax breaks, subsidies, and so on. This corruption is all legal. Lobbying the government is legal. Giving obscene amounts of donations to political parties is legal. Paying yourself, in effect, paying yourself 400 or 500 times what your workers are earning is legal. It's legal corruption. You probably all know the famous comment by Keynes, who said in the long run, we're all dead. What he meant, as a good economist, was we, meaning each of us as I. Because for economists, for most economists, there's no sense of community. There's a sense of the individual. And what Keynes meant is that in the long run, each of us will be dead. But the we, the collective we, may now turn out to be the real thing that Keynes inadvertently said. That in the long run, we may, and maybe not very long, we may be dead. Whether it's nuclear holocaust, whether it's global warming, whether it's epidemics of various illnesses, and an awful lot of that comes from the degree to which we have commercialized our world, the degree to which food, for example, the World Trade Organization. Did I mention that? Because did I mention that here? Or I mentioned it. I had some interviews, and I was thinking about it. The European Union, the EU, moved against genetically modified foods because the people in Europe were very concerned about it as a health issue. So some countries, the US, Canada, unfortunately, and Argentina, took them to the World Trade Organization court, and the EU lost. What, pardon the expression, what the hell was the World Trade Organization doing, pronouncing on a health issue? Where was the World Health Organization? Where were the elected governments of Europe and their right to decide what's important for their own people? This is globalization run absolutely wild. The international agencies with power are all economic. World Trade Organization, IMF, World Bank, plus Davos, the World Economic Forum, OECD. They're all economic, and they play the role largely of cheerleaders. They're not regulators at all. They're cheerleaders. In the 1930s, we discovered that unregulated markets are dangerous for the domestic economy. In 2008 or 2009, we discovered that unregulated markets are dangerous for the global economy. We didn't learn anything in the 30s. We didn't learn anything in the 30s. And because of the power of banks today, people are having trouble instituting any kind of controls on very dysfunctional transactions. Very dysfunctional. Thank you. So, now to get a little positive and a little less negative, let me say something about the private sector. I am a great fan of businesses and the private sector. I'm a great fan of businesses that respect me as a consumer and as a citizen. And there are a great many companies that do that. I am not a great fan of companies that try and exploit me or try and exploit my world. I am the beneficiary of wonderful. I walked into Heathrow Airport at 1:15, walked up to an agent and said, how can I get on the 2 o'clock flight? I booked on the 2 o'clock flight, and she said, you can check in over there, any of those counters. And then she stopped the transaction she was in the middle of, and she said, what's your name? And she handed me a boarding pass in about 30 seconds. I'm a great fan of that kind of corporate activity. I'm a great fan, or a big fan of iPhones and those things. I'm not a big fan of exploitation. So I've kind of changed T.S. Eliot's probably most famous lines. Can we cease from all our exploiting so that we can arrive where we started, know some peace for the first time? We're explorers as much as exploiters. We're all exploiters. We exploit each other. We exploit the environment. If you want to look at who's causing the problem or what's causing the problem in today's world, don't just look at the corporations. Look in the mirror. Look in the mirror. We went to South Africa. I have close friends who are the most environmentally conscious people I know. And I kept asking them with 20-degree temperatures outside to please turn off the air conditioning in the car. And I've had that in India many times. I know you have air conditioning. I know that means you're at status and you're wealthy. Please turn the bloody air conditioning off. It's not 30 degrees outside. It's 18 degrees outside and 16 degrees in this car. Please turn off the air conditioning. So, okay, let's get into politics. Ever since in the French assemblies, the ancien regime, the old regime, sat on the right, and the commoners, sat on the left, we've been stuck in this debate between left and right, and everything sort of revolves politically around left and right. I could have made that list on each side much deeper than it is. Public and private, communism, capitalism, Karl Marx, Adam Smith. Actually, one paragraph from Adam Smith about the brewer and the butcher and the baker. You read a lot of other things about Adam Smith, including his Moral Sentiments book, and you see a very different Adam Smith. Democracy of the proletariat versus free enterprise, no thank you. Nationalization, privatization. First there was the wave of nationalization, now the mindless nationalizations, then comes the wave of mindless privatizations. There are certain things that belong in government, there are certain things that belong in the private sector. Governments today, occupations and tea parties, the occupations of Wall Street and so on are supposed to be left, and the Tea Party is supposed to be right. Are they fundamentally so different? I read a piece or some comments made by Sarah Palin, and I thought, geez, I could have written those things. I'm totally in agreement with what she said, not everywhere. I'm okay with her hockey mom kind of thing because I'm Canadian, but all the other stuff. She was basically railing on about large institutions, whether they're large corporations, large banks, large governments. I couldn't argue with her. What we have is paralysis of one sort or another in the political process. Either we have governments that just can't move anywhere. You've got a Republican Party in the United States that is determined to block everything that Obama is prepared to do. So that's an example of paralysis. Or you've got France that flips back and forth between kind of moderate left, moderate right, but always going back and forth. So not much gets done because one side does something, the other side cancels it, then it goes back and cancels it again, and it keeps going back and forth. And so what we have is paralyzed government in many countries, but we don't have paralyzed societies, because if the public sector is paralyzed, the private sector is that much less constrained. And so what we have is more and more of that shift, dating long ago, but dating particularly as a kind of tipping point from 1989 is that shift to the private sector. There's another way of doing this, which is to take that line and kind of turn it around and say, instead of sliding back and forth between these two unacceptable extremes, why don't we see society as a kind of stool that sits on three legs for balance. And one leg is the public sector, which represents political forces. One leg is the private sector, which represents economic forces. And one leg is what I call the plural sector, which represents social forces. And what do I mean by plural? First of all, why the term plural? Because the other terms, one reason is because the other terms are all confusing. If we say NGOs, non-government organizations, well, businesses are technically NGOs, they're not government. If we say not-for-profit, then government is not-for-profit. So that's kind of confusing. If we say civil society, nobody knows what you're talking about after a while, especially the people who write books about it. It's kind of very confusing. And it's not an intuitively obvious label, although it goes way back. It goes back millennia. But it's not an intuitively natural label. So we don't know what civil society is. So I was looking for a word. At first I was calling it the social sector, which is fine except public sector, private sector, social sector. No, political sector, economic sector, social sector. So I was looking for another label, and somebody suggested, what about pluralistic? And I thought, plural, it's perfect. And when I've had discussions, workshops, where I put these three labels on, public, private, plural, the word plural enters into the discussion naturally. And that's important because the plural sector is invisible. It's not insignificant, it's invisible. If you think of it, we had a discussion today about India not having that much activity in the plural sector. And I said, well, what about Amul? What about, we had talked about Amul before. What about Maratha, a wonderful organization that organizes village women here? All kinds of activities. But maybe a country like Brazil probably has more. There's just a lot. What do I mean by the plural sector? I mean four things. I mean organizations that are member-owned, like Amul, co-ops, or unions are member-owned. Churches are de facto member-owned or officially member-owned, or they're non-owned. Greenpeace is not owned. McGill University, Harvard University are not owned. Doctors Without Borders is not owned. They have no owners. They're trusts, or whatever you want to call them. They have boards, but nobody owns them. And social movements, like we saw in Tahrir Square or in Occupation Wall Street, social movements, and social initiatives. Social initiatives would be something like the Grameen Bank for microfinancing, all kinds of things. There's just the HIV/AIDS activity in Brazil was an amazing social initiative that brought down the infection rates in that country enormously. Social movements kind of confront, as you saw in Tahrir Square or in Wall Street, social initiatives circulate. So if you're building a windmill on your property to get power that way, you're not confronting Exxon or BP or the coal companies. You're simply going around it. I think that governments will not be capable of making any significant change on their own now. I think too many of them have been too co-opted by the powerful forces in the private sector. They're seesawing or they're paralyzed. And I don't think we can look to government to solve our problems. The ultimate joke, I think, was the holding of a major environmental conference last year in Doha, in Qatar. The worst environmental footprint in the world is Qatar. They don't generate any of their own water. They bring water in by ship or by desalination. They don't even have water. And they're holding an environmental conference. It's almost the height of cynicism. It's like somebody holding it there is almost rubbing it in your face. But frankly, I don't think it was that at all. I don't think they ever thought about it because governments don't take these initiatives very seriously. So they send a lot of people and make a lot of noise and they fly around polluting the atmosphere that much worse with all their flights. And they created more pollution flying to these conferences than they ever resolved. So governments are not going to solve it. I'm all in favor of corporate social responsibility, and I applaud companies that are socially responsible. But anybody who believes in this environment that corporate social responsibility is going to make up for corporate social responsibility better get a job as a hermit. Because that's just fantasy. there are so many things going on today. And the latest thing that, just not the latest, but what came out in discussions during the morning, is pharmaceutical companies trying to patent certain herbal medicines that people have been using in this country for decades, for centuries or millennia. And suddenly they want to patent them so that people don't have the right to grow their own herbs and for medicinal purposes. It's complete and utter madness. So we've built these situations and it comes up all the time. So I call this belief that companies do well by doing good. In other words, by creating companies that build windmills or solar panels, all of which is good. But the thought that that's going to solve our problems, I call a win-win wonderland. It's not going to happen. What's making a resurgence, interestingly enough, is what's called the common. Economists, most economists, I'm sure there are exceptions in the room, but economists have been very negative about the common after an article particularly called The Tragedy of the Commons, which argued that it's difficult to control the use of that kind of property that's collectively held like that. It's not publicly held, it's not privately held. These seeds for these herbal medicines that people use in this country are not anybody's property. Subject people are selling seeds, but nobody owns a patent for these things. They're common. The Boston, if you've been to Boston, you know about the Boston Common. It's a park in the middle of Boston. It has that name because way back, people who didn't have land could graze their cows on the Boston Common. So it was a common property for various people to use. That diminished in influence, and now it's making a comeback because what's Wikipedia but the commons? What's all the open source software but the commons? So we're seeing a lot more sort of growth and development of the idea of common property, and it's going to have an effect. The thing I'm particularly enthusiastic about is what I call community-ship. Enough leadership. Alongside leadership and citizenship, leadership being more individualistic and citizenship being more collective, is community-ship. It's in between. It's the sense of communities and the role of communities in society. I think that if anything is going to start to get us out of this mess, it's community action. I just want to say one thing before I go on with that. The problem with governments are that they'll limit their crew, because they've got to treat everybody the same. So governments can be very crude. Sorry it takes 3 days to get a visa. Well, I'll believe it as an exception. Markets are crass, or can be crass. But communities, or the plural sector, can be closed. Witch hunts were communities-based. Nazism was a community-based movement. My point is that none of those sectors is the key to balancing society. The communists tried it on the left. We're now trying it on the right. Nazism tried it in the middle. The key is not any one sector. The key is balance between the sectors. The key is responsible governments. The key, respected governments, responsible markets, and robust communities. That's my view of things. The number of social movements that are taking place in the world right now are enormous. And go to any country, tap any town, go to anywhere, talk to anybody about a movement in their own little place in the world, and they'll tell you that. One of the interesting questions that one of the journalists asked me right now is, okay, you've got all these movements, but how do they coalesce into a kind of an overall sort of worldview? And I said, well, Gandhi was a movement. That certainly coalesced into the creation of the Indian state. You could say the same thing about the American Revolution, that these things start on the ground. They start with individual initiatives. And once governments and businesses get the message of what people will not tolerate, once that message comes through clear, for example, about global warming, then governments will have no choice but to act, and corporations will have no choice but to act seriously, as many now do, but the ones that don't will be forced to change their attitudes. So we need to look for balance. But the way, sorry, say that. The way to get there, I think, is with community initiatives. And you know, microfinancing made a huge difference for poor people, needing poor women in Bangladesh, but now all over the world, needing funds. And we need a movement in what I would call middle financing. We have lots of macro financing. We have more and more microfinancing. We need much more middle financing, because the key to economic development are really startup companies and middle-sized companies, not the big ones that tend to become exploiters, not all, but often, but the middle-level companies that are building and growing and full of energy. And we need to have much, much more of that. And who's going to do all this? You, me, and us. Nobody else. So as I said, if you want to look for the exploiters, look in the mirror. And to quote from Tom Paine, the pamphlet that helped spark the American Revolution, we have enough power to begin the world over again.